And why do you think the left has had such a, in your opinion, sort of backward approach to the Middle East?
Because of essentially the degeneration of the left since World War I. The German Revolution failed, and ever since then, the left has been trying to push the revolutionary subject further and further out into the periphery. First it was the Russian Empire, then it was the Chinese Empire, and then it was the undeveloped Third World. And at every step, it gets further and further from the industrial proletariat everywhere. My name's Eli Sennesh. I would usually introduce myself as a postdoc in neuroscience and neural data analysis, but today I would say just very educated person who took a bunch of the education he got and didn't go into Jewish communal NGO work, but did actually receive the background for it. And that's something of where my writing in the article we're going to discuss is coming from. We had, of all things, a DEI session here where I'm postdocing that was on this topic of the Israel-Gaza war, and God, that went badly.
How so?
So basically, they had someone from the history department to give a short talk in a DEI session where he basically summarizes the history of the conflict, starting entirely from the British Mandate in 1920-something, and continuing on to say, oh, those poor Jews, they were fleeing European anti-Semitism, but they ran into the arms of colonialism and imperialism and wound up as proxies for Britain and America in Palestine, oppressing these poor BIPOC Palestinians who did nothing wrong. And I don't think he expected anyone who actually had personal ties to the conflict to show up. The organizers did not appreciate someone interrupting to give practically, a parallel talk at every step.
So what's wrong with that narrative? You sort of walk me through it for someone who...
2 words, methodological eurocentrism. Like, I don't want to sound like Mr., postmodern standpoint theory identity politics, right? But if you're telling a story about 2 warring Middle Eastern countries that reduces entirely down to Europeans did things and these other people were done to the point that you're trying to take one of the warring sides and entirely assimilate them into Europeanness. And Ralph Leonard already criticizes this tendency in his article for sublation. Then, first of all, on a political level, sure, it's offensive, but also on an analytical and historical level, it's just incorrect. And so a lot of what I was trying to do in my article was to peel this back and say, look, if you try to talk about where this all came from, and if you try to just set your mind and say, okay, I want a solution based on, as I believe we were calling them, bourgeois rights, liberal rights for every individual, regardless of community or identity or any of that, then the first thing you find is that you have a lot of history to peel back in order to adjudicate everything. And then when you try to actually peel back all that history, what you find is that you're either going to come into conflict with the so-called liberation movement, or you are going to wind up adjudicating issues of liberal rights that are entirely internal to the supposedly oppressed polity or party. Like, you're going to wind up having to consider the internal history of the Ottoman Empire before there were any British occupiers, and how the Ottoman Empire crumbled and was turned into, successor states across the region.
So in your article, can you tell me sort of what's the main idea that you want to get across, that you think it's really important that people understand about this conflict?
The issue is not 2023. Okay, let's say 2 things. 1, and this is something I think any counterparties who take the other side from me can agree to. The issue is 1948. Trying to tell the Palestinian liberation movement to stop litigating 1948 over and over again makes you their enemy.
Arab states went to war with the Israelis after this. This is a big moment. 4 p.m., Rothschild Boulevard, David Ben-Gurion officially declaring Israel an independent state. The Jews finally have a home. His talk is pretty nationalistic and very thoughtful. He stresses on points like the state of Israel would strive to develop the land for the good of all its residents, be based upon foundations of liberty, justice, and peace, and that Israel would ensure social and political rights to all citizens without discrimination of religion, race, or sex. But did any of that happen? See, Palestine after World War I was under British control and was seeing a series of violent outbreaks between the Arabs and Jews. And to resolve that, the UN proposed a partition plan which would divide the land into 2 states, Jewish Israel and Arab Palestine, while keeping Jerusalem a UN-controlled international zone. The votes came in. 33 countries approved, 13 countries voted against it, while 10 completely abstained from voting. And although the Arab states walked out as a form of protest, the partition plan was adopted. On the ground, tensions were high, and they continued to escalate with the massacre at Deir Yassin. This started the mass exodus of Palestinians, while Jewish immigration, which was encouraged by the Zionists, was on the rise. The Arabs were becoming increasingly frustrated. As the atrocities kept growing and with the promise of an independent Arab state nowhere in sight, Israel officially declaring its independence triggered a tipping point. Arab forces from Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq marched to Palestine. This was the first time the Arab League was formed. And for what? To protect Arab Palestine. To put it into context, the Arab states had just recently declared their own independence from colonial powers, so Arab nationalism was on the rise. And although Arab leaders agreed on the importance of forming a unified Palestinian state, their interests came first. Fawaz Gerges, a professor of international relations, mentioned this about the Egyptian and Jordanian kings, that they appeared to be more concerned about their respective strategic positions than that of Israel. And according to historian Avishlam, the conflict between the Jews and Arabs allowed for the emergence of special relations between the Zionists and Abdullah, who wanted to secure his plans to expand the borders of his country. Nevertheless, the armies of the Arab League launched an attack, and in just a few weeks, Israeli forces were surrounded, facing a possible defeat. That's when the UN intervened with a 4-week ceasefire, which worked in favor of Israel. Ignoring the UN arms embargo, Israel imported heavy armaments from Czechoslovakia and used the time to reorganize. This brings us to a turning point in the history of the war. As soon as the ceasefire was over, Israel launched a counter-offensive, occupying 2 strategic Arab towns which were allocated to Arab Palestine by the UN. 70,000 Palestinians who lived there were forced to flee. The Israelis closed in and continued occupying the areas allocated to the Palestinians. And the Arab armies were not as effective as they were in the first round of fighting. There was little coordination and virtually no cooperation, says Avishlam. The Arab states who were led by Egypt responded by announcing the establishment of a Gaza-based Palestinian government. But this was more of a strategic move by King Farouk to prevent King Abdullah's ambitions to expand his borders. Israel watched the Arab feud, all the while consolidating its own position. It began singling out Egyptian forces with an aerial campaign. Egypt appealed to its Arab allies for help, but its appeals fell on deaf ears. And Avishlam says that the Arab states were either afraid to intervene or did not wish to intervene. By the end of the year, the Egyptians were defeated in Gaza and could no longer support the dream of a unified Palestinian homeland. Desperate, Egypt turned to Britain for help to preserve its territorial integrity. An armistice was signed with Israel, and the other Arab states followed suit and signed separate bilateral agreements with Israel, who now was controlling 78% of the entire territory. This brings us to the end of the war. What did the First Arab-Israeli War bring? An Egyptian military presence in the Gaza Strip, and Jordan was gifted the West Bank as a token for its loyalty to Britain and the Zionists. Meanwhile, 700,000 Palestinians were driven out of their homeland. And the UN's two-state solution? Well, it never saw the light of day. It's been 70 years. The crisis of this catastrophe continues.
That is, relitigating 1948 is the point. You can't distract them from it. You can't divert them from it. If you try, you will be told you're doing liberal Zionism. And politically, that makes it extremely difficult to be on the left, because if you're a leftist, say, in the US and Canada, you distinguish yourselves from the Democrats or the liberals in Canada by your willingness to stand in solidarity with Palestinian liberation against liberal Zionism. So you're letting, you leftists, you are letting yourself be subjected to a form of ideological discipline that is going to put you in conflict with your own principles because you keep trying to make the issue something other than what the issue is. Now, I think the more controversial statement I would make is the real issue is that the Tanzimat period was never really seen through. The Ottoman Empire was never fully and properly put through not just a breakup into nation states, but a proper bourgeois revolution. And so there's no year zero that you can go back to and say, here's a revolution, here's a declaration of the rights of humankind. Here's where someone made everybody equal. They never were made equal. That maybe there was a period of about 10 years when you could claim that process was at work. 10, maybe at the outside, let's give it 40. But between the passage of the Tanzimat and the formation of really the crystallization of pan-Arabism as a political movement is a very short period of time. And by the time you have that crystallization, you have a rejection of minorities in the region. You have this tarring of minorities in the region as quote unquote colonizers, because the minorities don't want to go along with this project of saying, we're going to take a Turkish Muslim empire and turn it into a series of Arab Muslim states, nation states or kingdoms that are going to be culturally Arab and Muslim. These tributary minorities don't want to be part of the derivative imperial majority's nationalism project. And so they're tarred as colonizers. And I would say that's really the root of things.
One of the things that I've been arguing with my dad about is that he sees what's happening in Israel-Palestine as a repeat of everywhere that there is colonization. He says, it's just typical, and I've heard this line a lot. It's just typical colonizers. That's what they do. They come in and they kick you off your land and then they oppress you. And that's all that's happening here. And the people are just fighting back as the oppressed have done throughout history. And he used a couple of examples of times in which indigenous people fought back, and however, uselessly in the end, but did, and were celebrated for it at the time. Why is that wrong? Why is that not a good analogy?
So I just want to quote what Ralph Leonard wrote and then respond to it in order to answer this. So Ralph Leonard writes, a settler colonial movement is in simple terms the movement of settlers from one part of the world to another, irrevocably transforming that territory into their own sovereign polity, usually autonomous from an imperial center, almost always at the loss of the native inhabitants who are already there, whether in part or in whole. Now, my response is, I think we need a concept, I think settler colonialism is a useful concept to have for analyzing certain instances in history. The United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand are sort of the canonical examples. I think it is not useful for analyzing Israel-Palestine unless we relax to this definition that Ralph Leonard gives. And then the problem is, how do you distinguish settler colonialism from, and I mean this seriously, mass immigration or any other form of contestation over territory?
Well, I suppose they would say that with colonialism, you're displacing people. With immigration, you're assimilating people.
So what happens so in all seriousness, what happens if immigrants don't want to assimilate culturally? They follow the law, but they don't want to assimilate culturally. Let's say they make their own towns, they persist in speaking their own language, they run their own social services. I'm thinking partly of Kiryas Joel in New York in this instance, these little self-constructed Jewish fundamentalist neo-shtetls. But I'm also thinking of every other minority, ethnic neighborhood in the history of the United States and Canada.
Well, I mean,
plus, to some degree, let's say it, Muslim immigration in Europe right now. Because I think it's actually very reasonable in that case to say, look, these people are refugees. Giving them safe haven from Bashar al-Assad is not an agreement to an entirely new social contract that requires them to erase who they were previously and become Germans and Frenchmen. Why would they want to become Germans and Frenchmen? They're Syrians.
Well, some people want to assimilate, some people don't. And the nature of migration toward the present too is that a lot of people, well, I mean, this isn't anything new, but the idea is that it's temporary. And so anyway, but I guess.
Yes, but I guess what I'm saying is when you're talking about liberal rights, liberal bourgeois modern rights do include the right for an individual to make that choice themselves.
Right. Okay. So then, the difference is that you live in a liberal bourgeois democracy and kind of live by its rules. And you don't kind of set yourself up as the majority with your language, your religion, whatever. You remain sort of a minority within a broader kind of culture. So I guess, so then the difference here is that you've
Except that in your neighborhood, you do set yourself up with all those things. Or within your town, or in the case of some Utah just occurred to me, or in the case of Utah, your own state within a federation. Or, we can have, I guess we can run through examples and counterexamples. But what I would say in response to Ralph Leonard here is, I think that definition is too broad. It captures the canonical examples, Canada, United States, Australia, New Zealand. It also seems to capture almost anything and everything else. Any change of sovereignty or territorial possession between quote unquote peoples can go under that definition of settler colonialism. And if everything is settler colonialism, then A, it does very little analytic work. And B, it has very little political impulse. There's very little normative reason when someone says, that's a settler colony. Okay, so people are in contestation. There was contestation over land. Is this now a reason to dismantle it? Is this a reason it's a bad thing? I think I think being a bad thing is part of the concept of a settler colony. And so we should have a narrower definition that still allows us to condemn settler colonialism rather than this larger definition by which we end up saying, oh, some of my best friends are settler colonists. Everyone's a settler colonist. It's fine. Which is what Leonard actually says in the end. I mean, he basically says, like, sure, there's settler colonialism, but, some settler colonies are constitutional republics and therefore good, actually.
Right.
Or
So what I wound up responding to my dad was like, a lot of the people that came to Canada, and for instance, our ancestors, they cleared the land for farming and that sort of thing. The Irish people, our ancestors were some of the very first people in that area. And eventually, a lot of them intermarried with the native people. They were equally poor, they had a lot in common. They were often very working class. And I said to my dad, is that really a bad outcome? Because the Irish people were fleeing famine and so on, and their own persecution. Part of the reason also why they felt an affinity with the native people. And is it right, really, to think of them as fair game for murder and so on because they were colonizers by your definition? When they too were being oppressed and were fleeing injustice. And that was the analogy that I gave to my dad. I don't know if what do you think of that? Is that a better analogy?
I think that's a deeply moral and ethical thing to say. I also think it points towards a useful political criterion, which is that, let's say proper settler colonialism, I think should be taken to involve some kind of, mother state, like a mother country that is actually economically and militarily sponsoring the settler colony.
Yeah. So David
British, is Britain in Canada sponsoring an Irish immigration by pushing the Irish out of Ireland with famine? No, actually, I don't think so. Like, if you're running from the British and ending up somewhere, I don't think the British are sponsoring you.
Well, the British were kind of solving their problems by exporting populations, right? So they wanted to clear land and that kind of thing. There was this quote unquote useless people that were occupying lands that were better used for quote unquote better used for whatever purposes the landowners wanted. And, criminals and all that famously. So they were using North America and Australia and they were using the colonies as a solution to their internal problems, I suppose. But I guess the bigger kind of point.
Like It or Not, The Politics of War is Upon Us by David Jameson, 11th of December, 2023. Elsewhere in Sublation magazine, and in a much more useful effort, Ralph Leonard defends the conception of Israel as a colonial state, a claim which has become a focus of rage for apologists of the Gaza war. He makes the vital point, missed by so many in his milieu, that the undoubted backwardness of much modern decolonial thought doesn't cancel out the obviously settler colonial character of the Israeli state. Further, he argues that objections to Israel's colonial status cannot overcome the simple, observable reality that Israel is a settler colonial state today because of its active settler colonization on the West Bank and East Jerusalem, premised on further dispossession and displacement of Palestinians. In many ways, his essay is an elegant restatement of the classic socialist analysis of the origins of the Palestinian tragedy, but with two startling absences. The first is the role of the United States. As is well known, the Israeli state benefits enormously from close relations with the U.S., though it is less well known just how close these relations are. Israel is a small state with 9.5 million inhabitants, 2 million of whom are Arabs, with de facto second-class status and without full access to state resources. Yet it has received funds and promises from the U.S. worth approximately $170 billion since 1948. The U.S. covers around 40% of the Israel Defense Force's entire budget, and nearly its entire procurement budget. Israel has unusual access to U.S. arms manufacturers for a foreign country, being able to purchase weapons directly from them without having to go through the U.S. government. The U.S. has bought and paid for Israel's armed presence in the region, And in addition, Israel is covered by U.S. security guarantees. And this is only the U.S. contribution. Other Western allies supply arms and security services of their own. Early in his essay, Leonard skewers the common claim that Israel cannot be a colony because it has no metropolis, no home base from which the colony is established and resourced. He points, correctly, to the British Empire as the original scaffolding for the settler state in the era of the British Mandate, but he fails to bring this analysis up to date. Israel still has a metropolis, which it requires for its survival, but from which it exercises relative independence, the U.S.
David Jameson claims that there is a sponsoring colonial state, and that's the United States. And he criticizes Ralph Leonard for not recognizing that's really who's at play here, that Israel gets, preferential access to weapons for such a tiny state with a small population. They get a ton of funds, that sort of thing. So really, it makes more sense to think of it in terms of a colony of the United States.
So let's actually take this seriously rather than just go rah-rah.
Mm-hmm.
When would that colonization have started? In 73? Serious U.S. sponsorship of the state of Israel did not start until 1973. Mm-hmm. Initially, Israel was very, very initially, it was a Soviet ally. Then it was almost, but not quite in the then it was almost in the non-aligned movement. Then it turned west in 56, but was still really more closely associated with France and Czechoslovakia. Then in 67, I believe the French cut them off and they spent, a bunch of years without any Western patron or ally. Then in 73, the Americans started. So, could we talk analytically, could we talk about an American colonization of an already existing state of Israel? Actually, I think that would be, maybe this is my Ralph Leonard moment, but I think that would be an interesting analytical lens to use, because you go to Israel and it is so clear that the country is under the spell of the United States. I come as an American and try to tell Israelis, hey, I'm from that their imperial core, and y'all need to read Noam Chomsky. This isn't being done for your benefit. Mm-hmm. And people are so disbelieving that all this American friendship could be anything less than benevolent.
Well, how would you describe yourself in terms of politically, in terms of the conflict? Would you call yourself a left-wing Zionist?
Yes, unequivocally.
Mm-hmm. So what does that mean?
So I would say, if I had to give a slogan, I would say the core of left-wing Zionism, I'm going to even say revolutionary Zionism, the view of Zionism as revolution, is politicizing the diaspora and politicizing the enforced second-class status of not just Jews as individuals, but Jews as civil society throughout the diaspora. Because the Jewish question, as I basically argue in a whisper in my article, the Jewish question is not just something that came up in Europe in modernity. It's also something that came up in the Ottoman Empire or Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam in modernity. It's a problem when it's this problem that comes up when you try to convert essentially a quasi-theocratic feudal empire into a series of modern bourgeois democracies, or at least modern bourgeois republics, some of which are unfortunately less than democratic. And you find that when you were a feudal society, you conquered these people and ghettoized them and oppressed them in a very straightforwardly hierarchical way. Like you had a military, you conquered all this area where they had already been living. You said to them, we've conquered you. You're our subjects now. Kneel, like kneel or die, basically. Okay, they kneeled. So you confine them, you pass laws against them, etc., etc. Now you declare yourself a republic, and you have a declaration of the rights of man, and you find that you have this entirely unwanted, formerly conquered internal colony on your hands. And because it is, concentrated but minoritized, you don't know what to do with it. And so one thing you come up with is to say, well, all right, they can have individual rights, but only insofar as they don't use those rights to challenge the social order. Only so long as they don't do politics with those rights.
Mm-hmm.
If they do politics, it has to be in terms of what the majority is divided along the lines of and what the majority wants. They can't have their own politics. And that's where I think you run into this contradiction between bourgeois rights and this thing that gets called the Jewish question. And I also think it's not necessarily Jews. Like, Romani are persecuted in Europe for much the same reason.
Mm-hmm.
They were a non-peasant nomadic population interspersed throughout Europe. Then you have Kurds and Imazigan. I'm probably not pronouncing Imazigan correctly, but I'm told Berber is a slur. So, you have like Kurds, Imazigan, Assyrians, and a few other groups in the Middle East and North Africa who similarly were conquered by the Islamic caliphates, made explicitly second class. Then you have modernity, and everyone basically says, well, we have to give them rights, but we also have to maintain their position in society. Like, we don't want to actually start ceding resources and territory to these people we once conquered. And I would say, the thing that makes all of these things, the thing that's going to generate contradiction and revolutionary movement here is that, of course, when you tell people you have rights, but only if you use them the right way, what's the first thing they're going to think? How do I use them the wrong way? How do I give you guys the finger? Because, people want to be free.
Visit patreon.com/Ashley A. Frawley for part 2.